Picture this. September 11th, 1944. A German Oberst stands at his command post near Wallendorf, binoculars trembling in his hands. Through the morning mist, he sees something that makes his blood run cold. Not tanks, not infantry, but both, moving as one organism across the Moselle Valley. Half-tracks packed with riflemen roll 30 meters behind Sherman tanks, never falling behind, never separating. Unmöglich, he whispers. Impossible. The Americans have done what German blitzkrieg never perfected. They've fused armor and infantry into a single, unstoppable weapon. Within hours, his defensive line will cease to exist. Within days, the 46th Armored Infantry Battalion will become the first Allied unit to breach the German border, and Wehrmacht commanders will learn a new kind of terror. The date was September 14, 1944, and Hauptmann Klaus Reinhardt was about to witness the end of everything he'd been promised. He stood in a sandbagged observation post 3 kilometers inside the German frontier, watching the road that wound through the dense Ardennes forest toward Wallendorf. His hands, calloused from 3 years of Eastern Front combat, gripped the edge of the concrete bunker. The Siegfried Line, the West Wall, as propaganda called it, stretched behind him in elaborate fortifications that had taken years to construct. Dragon's Teeth tank obstacles marched across the hills like prehistoric monuments. Pillboxes dotted every strategic height. Minefields, registered artillery coordinates, interlocking fields of fire. Festung Europa, Fortress Europe. Reinhardt had believed in it once, before Normandy, before the race across France became a rout, before American mechanized columns began appearing where German intelligence swore they couldn't be for another week. The sound reached him first, a distant rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once, not the grinding treads of tanks alone, which he knew intimately from Kursk and Kharkov. This was different, layered. Tank engines, yes, but intermixed with the higher-pitched whine of half-track transmissions, the diesel throb of trucks, all moving in synchronized cadence. Through his binoculars, he saw them emerge from the tree line. M4 Sherman tanks in the vanguard, their 75mm guns traversing methodically. But 30 meters behind each tank, and this detail made his stomach clench, came M3 half-tracks, their open tops packed with infantrymen in combat gear. The vehicles moved in perfect intervals, maintaining spacing with mechanical precision. When the lead Sherman paused to negotiate a destroyed bridge, the half-track stopped instantly. When the tank resumed, so did the infantry carriers. They moved like a single creature. Reinhardt had fought American infantry in Normandy. Brave, certainly. Well-equipped, absolutely. But they'd advanced on foot, becoming separated from their armor support in the Bocage nightmare. German POC-40 anti-tank guns had picked off isolated Shermans. German infantry had pinned down American riflemen who'd outrun their tanks. The blitzkrieg problem in reverse, combined arms warfare breaking down under the friction of combat. This was different. Herr Hauptmann, his radio man called, voice tight, Oberkommando wants to know strength estimates. Reinhardt kept watching. Behind the first wave of tanks and half-tracks came more and more. The entire visible road network was filling with vehicles, all maintaining that same synchronized spacing, that same mechanical coordination. Tell them. He paused, calculating. Each half-track carried perhaps 10 men. He could see at least 30 vehicles in the immediate sector. Tell them we're facing battalion-strength armored infantry, American 5th Armored Division markings. They're not just supported by tanks, they're integrated with them. The radio man repeated the message. Silence. Then, Sir, Oberkommando asks for clarification. Armored infantry? Infantry that moves with the armor. Infantry that never separates from the armor. Infantry on tracks that keep pace with the tanks. Another pause. Sir, they're asking if you're certain. Reinhardt lowered his binoculars. In the valley below, the American column had reached the first belt of German obstacles. The lead Sherman fired, the crack of its gun echoing across the hills. Before the smoke cleared, the half-tracks behind it had already deployed their infantry, not slowly, not cautiously. but in practiced, fluid motion. Men hit the ground in assault lines, moving immediately toward the German positions with covering fire from the half-track's 50 caliber machine guns. The tank advanced. The infantry cleared the obstacles. The half-tracks repositioned. It happened in less than 3 minutes. "I'm certain," Reinhardt said quietly. "Tell them we need heavy reinforcements. Tell them the Americans have created something new." What Reinhardt was witnessing, what would soon terrorize German commanders across the Western Front, was the operational debut of the 46th Armored Infantry Battalion, a unit that would rewrite the tactical textbook of modern warfare and become the vanguard of the Allied thrust that shattered the myth of Festung Europa. But to understand why this battalion represented such a revolutionary shock to Wehrmacht doctrine, we must first understand what made it different and why German commanders, who had pioneered mechanized warfare, found themselves psychologically and tactically unprepared for what was rolling toward them through the autumn of 1944. The evolution of a nightmare. The concept seemed simple on paper, infantry that could keep pace with tanks. In practice, every army that had tried combined arms warfare since 1939 had struggled with the same fundamental problem. Tanks were fast, infantry was slow. When armor rushed ahead, it became vulnerable to anti-tank weapons and infantry ambush. When infantry advanced on foot, they arrived at objectives hours after the armor, leaving tanks isolated and exposed. The German blitzkrieg had partially solved this by using trucks to transport infantry quickly, but trucks couldn't follow tanks cross-country. They couldn't provide fire support while moving, and critically, infantry had to dismount far from the objective, then advance on foot through the final, most dangerous zone where enemy anti-tank weapons waited. The 46th Armored Infantry Battalion, officially activated in 1942 as part of the U.S. Army's new armored division structure, took a different approach. Every rifleman in the battalion rode in an M3 half-track, a vehicle that could traverse rough terrain, ford streams, and keep pace with Sherman tanks across open country. The half-tracks were armed with 50 caliber machine guns and could lay down suppressing fire while infantry dismounted directly into assault. Critically, the battalion trained not as separate infantry that happened to have vehicles, but as mechanized infantry that fought as an organic extension of the tank units. Captain Robert Thompson, a company commander in the 46th, later described the doctrine, "We didn't support the tanks, we didn't follow the tanks, we were part of the tank team. When a Sherman encountered resistance, we were already there, not arriving 15 minutes later, but there immediately, dismounting and dealing with whatever was stopping the armor." This integration required completely new training methods. Tank commanders and infantry platoon leaders conducted combined planning. Radio protocols were standardized so armor and infantry could communicate instantly. Tactics were developed for specific scenarios. Encountering a POC gun position, infantry dismounts and flanks while tank provides covering fire. Entering a village, tank leads but infantry clears buildings immediately behind. Breaching fortifications, engineer infantry places charges while tanks suppress enemy fire. By the summer of 1944, when the 5th Armored Division landed in France as part of Patton's Third Army, the 46th Armored Infantry Battalion had trained together for nearly 2 years. They'd run hundreds of combined exercises. They knew their tank crews by name. They could coordinate complex assaults using minimal radio traffic. German intelligence had reports about American armored infantry units. But reports were one thing. Facing them in combat was something else entirely. First contact, the French countryside, August 1st, 1944, near Le Mans, France. Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann commanded a company of Panzer Grenadiers, German mechanized infantry themselves, equipped with half-tracks and trained in combined arms tactics. When American armor was reported approaching his sector, he felt confident. His men had stopped Allied tank attacks before. You let the tanks come close, held your fire until the last moment, then engaged with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets from concealed positions. The tanks would button up, slow down, call for infantry support, infantry that would have to advance on foot, giving you time to either destroy the tanks or withdraw in good order. Standard doctrine, proven in Normandy. Through his field glasses, Hoffman watched the American column approach down the D road, 5 Sherman tanks in line, cautiously advancing. He smiled. Overconfident Americans pushing their armor ahead without proper reconnaissance. He keyed his radio. "Wait for my order, let them come close." The lead Sherman was 200 meters away now. In the farmhouse to Hoffman's left, 3 of his best men waited with Panzerfausts. In the stone barn to his right, 2 more. Crossfire positions, perfect ambush geometry, 100 meters. That's when Hoffman saw them. Behind each Sherman, matching its speed exactly, came an M3 half-track. The vehicles maintained precise 30-meter intervals. As Hoffman watched, confused, the Sherman column suddenly halted. No warning, no apparent reason. They'd detected something. What happened next took less than 90 seconds. The half-tracks didn't stop behind the tanks. They immediately flanked left and right, spreading into a line formation. Infantry dismounted, not slowly, not one at a time, but in coordinated squads, weapons already shouldered. The Shermans rotated their turrets, 75mm guns covering the suspected ambush positions, and the infantry, instead of advancing cautiously, moved in a practiced assault line with covering fire from the half-track machine guns. Hoffman keyed his radio frantically. "Engage! Engage now!" The Panzerfaust team in the farmhouse rose to fire. The nearest half-track's 50 caliber opened up instantly, 50 caliber rounds chewing through the stone wall. The German team went down. The barn team managed to fire 1 rocket. It missed, the Panzerfaust's notoriously short effective range making the shot difficult, and then American infantry was through the barn door, clearing the position with rifle fire and grenades. 90 seconds. From column movement to assault completion. 90 seconds. Hoffman's company retreated in disorder, leaving 4 dead and 6 wounded. The American column resumed its advance immediately, as if the engagement had been a mere traffic delay. That evening, Hoffman filed his after-action report. His hands shook as he wrote, "Enemy employs new tactical system. Infantry and armor function as single unit. Response time makes ambush tactics ineffective. Recommend..." He stared at the incomplete sentence. "Recommend what? How did you fight an enemy that reacted faster than you could complete your attacks?" The reports began flooding into Wehrmacht intelligence offices through August and early September. American 5th Armored Division, always the same pattern. Tanks and infantry moving together, responding to threats with mechanical speed, never allowing German forces time to isolate either arm. And in every report, the same unit identifier kept appearing, 46th Armored Infantry Battalion. The race to Germany, September 5, 1944. The 46th Battalion was spearheading the 5th Armored Division's advance toward the German border, part of the broader Allied pursuit of disintegrating Wehrmacht forces across France. Private First Class James Morrison, a rifleman in Company A, sat in the second bench of his half-track, M1 Garand rifle between his knees. The vehicle rocked and bounced over the French countryside at 30 miles per hour. Ahead he could see the Sherman that his squad was paired with Big Bertha, her crew called her, commanded by Lieutenant Danny Cortez. Morrison had joined the battalion in July as a replacement. Back in training, they'd told him about armored infantry tactics, but he hadn't really understood until his first combat action. The half-track wasn't just transportation. It was a fighting vehicle, a supply depot, a communications hub, and his home. After 6 weeks of combat, he knew every rivet, every oil stain, every quirk of its temperamental transmission. More importantly, he knew Lieutenant Cortez's voice on the radio, knew exactly how Big Bertha moved when she spotted trouble, knew that when Cortez's tank swung its turret right, his squad needed to be ready to dismount and sweep left. "Contact front." The call came over the radio, calm, professional. Morrison Sergeant Buck Harris, a Kentucky veteran who'd been with the battalion since activation, rapped his knuckles twice on the half-track's metal side. The driver decelerated. Morrison and the other 9 men in the vehicle automatically checked weapons, shifted to combat positions. Ahead, Big Bertha had stopped at a crossroads. The 75mm gun was pointed at a German roadblock, logs, an overturned truck, and what looked like a PaK-40 anti-tank gun dug in behind sandbags. Harris studied the position through binoculars. Pot gun, maybe 10 infantry. Standard delaying action. He keyed the radio. Bertha will flank right through that orchard. Give us suppressing fire on the 3 count. Roger, Cortez's voice came back. On your count. The half-track swung right off the road, bouncing through a ditch and into an apple orchard. Morrison's knuckles whitened on his rifle. He'd done this 17 times now. It never stopped being terrifying. 3, 2, 1, Big Bertha fired. The 75mm high explosive round hit the sandbag position, not close enough to destroy the pack gun, but close enough to make the German crew duck. Simultaneously, the half-track burst from the orchard tree line, 50 caliber chattering. Harris was out before the vehicle stopped, Morrison and the squad following in practiced succession, left, left, right, right, alternating sides to avoid bunching. They hit the ground running, rifles up. The pack gun crew was trying to traverse their weapon to meet this new threat. Too slow. Morrison fired twice at a German soldier silhouetted against the sky. The man dropped. Harris threw a grenade that detonated behind the sandbag wall. The surviving Germans raised their hands. From first contact to position secured, 4 minutes. The column rolled on. This pattern repeated 30, 40, 50 times as the 5th Armored Division raced across eastern France. German delaying forces would establish roadblocks, prepare ambushes, dig in anti-tank guns, and the 46th's combined tank infantry teams would break through with a speed that made traditional defensive tactics obsolete. On September 11, 1944, forward elements of the 5th Armored Division with the 46th Battalion in the vanguard crossed into Luxembourg. They pushed east, encountering increasingly desperate German resistance. Wehrmacht units were falling back toward the Siegfried Line, trying to establish a coherent defense before the Allies could breach the Reich's frontier. 3 days later, on September 14th, the 46th Armored Infantry Battalion became the first Allied ground unit to enter German territory, crossing the Auer River near Wallendorf. Hauptmann Reinhardt, the officer we met earlier, watched them come. Breaching Fortress Europe. The Siegfried Line had been designed to be impregnable. Built in the late 1930s, the West Wall stretched from the Swiss border to the Low Countries, a defense in depth featuring thousands of concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, mine fields, and mutually supporting strong points. German propaganda had spent years depicting it as an unbreachable barrier, the final shield protecting the fatherland. For Wehrmacht commanders retreating across France in September 1944, the Siegfried Line represented hope. If they could just reach it, just establish a defense behind its fortifications, they could stop the Allied advance, stabilize the front, buy time for Germany to mobilize new forces or develop new wonder weapons. The 46th Armored Infantry Battalion reached the Siegfried Line on September 14th and attacked the same day. Lieutenant Colonel John McCullough, commanding the 46th, stood in his command half-track studying aerial reconnaissance photos of the German fortifications. The concrete bunkers were formidable, 6-foot-thick walls, interlocking fields of fire, positioned on commanding terrain. Dragon's Teeth tank obstacles designed to stop armor dead stretched across every vehicle approach. Minefields covered the gaps. Traditional infantry assault doctrine called for artillery preparation, infantry advance to fix the enemy, engineers to breach obstacles, then armor exploitation once a gap was open. The process typically took hours or days. McCullough looked at his officers. "We don't have hours. 5th Armored is tasked with maintaining momentum. If we slow down, the Germans establish a real defense line, and this war lasts another 6 months." The attack plan they developed used the battalion's integrated capabilities in a way that would have been impossible for conventional infantry. Phase 1. Tank infantry teams would advance directly at the fortifications, using speed and aggression to reach the obstacles before German defenders could establish effective fire. The half-track's mobility would allow infantry to stay with the tanks across rough terrain that would slow foot soldiers. Phase 2. Engineer squads riding in modified half-tracks loaded with explosives would breach the Dragon's Teeth under covering fire from tanks and infantry. The half-tracks could get engineers to the obstacles quickly and provide armored protection during the dangerous demolition work. Phase 3. The moment a breach opened, tank infantry teams would punch through before German reserves could seal it, then fan out behind the fortification line, attacking bunkers from the rear where their concrete walls were thinner. It was audacious. It was risky. It relied entirely on speed, coordination, and the assumption that German defenders, trained for set-piece defensive battles, wouldn't be able to react fast enough to this fluid, mechanized assault. September 15th, 0600 hours. The attack commenced. Private Morrison's half-track rumbled forward through pre-dawn darkness. Ahead, Big Bertha's silhouette was barely visible. The tank's engine note changed. Cortez was accelerating to combat speed. "Here we go," Sergeant Harris muttered. German flares burst overhead, bathing the landscape in harsh white light. Machine gun fire erupted from concealed bunker positions. Morrison heard the distinctive crack, crack, crack of German MG-42s, the weapons that American GIs called Hitler's buzzsaw for their terrifying rate of fire. Tracers streamed past. Something pinged off the half-track's armor. Big Bertha fired, the muzzle blast so close Morrison felt it in his chest. A German machine gun nest vanished in dust and smoke. The half-track lurched over rough ground, bouncing so hard Morrison's teeth clacked together. Through the chaos, he could hear Lieutenant Cortez on the radio, calm and precise. Alpha 2, bunker at 10 o'clock. Bravo 1, covering fire on my target. They reached the Dragon's teeth. Massive concrete pyramids, 4 feet high, arranged in staggered rows. Big Bertha halted, turret traversing to cover the approach. The half-track swung alongside. Harris was already moving. Engineers up. Everyone else, suppressing fire on that bunker. Morrison emptied his Garand clip at a concrete bunker 400 meters away. He couldn't tell if he hit anything, but that wasn't the point. The point was to make the Germans keep their heads down while the engineers worked. Somewhere to his left, he heard the crump of explosives. A gap appeared in the Dragon's teeth. Big Bertha gunned her engine and pushed through, treads grinding over broken concrete. The half-track followed instantly, Morrison's squad clinging to the benches as the vehicle bounced through the breach. They were through the first line. Behind the fortifications, the terrain opened up, and suddenly German bunkers that had been impregnable from the front were vulnerable from the rear. Big Bertha's 75mm engaged pillboxes at close range, firing through vision slits and doors. Morrison's squad dismounted and cleared positions with grenades and rifle fire. The breakthrough had taken 19 minutes. By nightfall on September 15th, the 46th Battalion had punched 3 separate gaps in the Siegfried Line and was operating 5 kilometers inside German territory. Other American units poured through the breaches. The West Wall, the fortress that was supposed to be impregnable, had been breached on the first day of sustained assault. For German commanders, it was a catastrophe, but more than a military defeat, it was a psychological one. The Americans hadn't just overcome the Siegfried Line, they'd made it look easy, fast, mechanical, inevitable. The psychology of terror. In his command post near Bitburg, General Major Hans Kruger read the reports with something approaching disbelief. The West Wall breached, American armor operating freely inside German territory, multiple defensive positions overrun in minutes, not hours. And always the same pattern, tanks and infantry moving together, reacting faster than German forces could respond, never giving defenders time to isolate and destroy either arm. Kruger was a veteran of Poland, France, and Russia. He'd commanded armored divisions in the Great Encirclement battles of 1941. He understood mechanized warfare, understood blitzkrieg doctrine. But this was something different. The telephone rang, Wehrmacht High Command demanding explanations. How had the Americans broken through so quickly? What could be done to stop them? Kruger chose his words carefully. The Americans have perfected what we attempted but never achieved, true integration of armor and infantry at the tactical level. Their armored infantry battalions function as single organisms. When our POC guns engage their tanks, infantry is already flanking the position. When our infantry concentrates on their infantry, tanks destroy us. And their speed of reaction, he paused. They respond faster than we can complete our attacks. This is defeatism, Herr General. This is reality. We designed blitzkrieg to exploit breakthrough with rapid armor exploitation, but our infantry always fell behind. In France, in Russia, everywhere. The Americans have solved that problem. Their infantry keeps pace with their armor, always. And psychologically, he stopped. Continue. Psychologically, our men don't know how to fight them. They're trained to fight either tanks or infantry with different tactics for each. The Americans force them to fight both simultaneously. It's disorienting, paralyzing. The truth was worse than Kruger could articulate in an official report. German soldiers were beginning to fear the 5th Armored Division specifically, and the 46th Battalion particularly. You could hear it in the after-action reports, in the prisoner interrogations, in the informal communications between units. German infantry encountering American half-tracks would expect time to establish positions, dig in, prepare anti-armor ambushes. But the half-tracks didn't give them time. They arrived with the tanks and immediately deployed infantry, who attacked with the same momentum as the armor. German Pak gun crews, master tank hunters who destroyed hundreds of Soviet T-34s, found their carefully prepared ambush positions overrun by American infantry before they could engage more than 1 or 2 Shermans. German armor, already outmatched by American numbers and industrial capacity, discovered they couldn't isolate American tanks for favorable engagements because those tanks were never isolated. Infantry was always there immediately, clearing flanking positions and protecting the armor's vulnerable sides and rear. It created a kind of tactical helplessness. Oberfeldwebel Kurt Steiner, a squad leader with 15 months of Eastern Front experience, described it in a letter to his wife that was intercepted by American intelligence. The Americans don't fight like we do, like the Soviets do, like anyone does. Their tanks and soldiers move as one thing. You cannot separate them. You cannot find a weakness. They come fast, they hit hard, and they never stop. Yesterday we ambushed an American tank, destroyed it with a Panzerfaust. Before we could retreat, American infantry was on us. They'd been right behind the tank we killed. 3 of my men dead. Where did they come from so fast? How were they already there? The 46th Battalion was creating a new kind of warfare, and German defenders, for all their experience and tactical skill, had no doctrine, no training, and increasingly no psychological resilience to counter it. But the 46th's most severe test was still coming. Hürtgen. The Forest of Death, November 1944. The Hürtgen Forest. If there was a place designed to destroy the 46th Battalion's advantages, it was here. The Hürtgenwald covered 50 square miles of steep, heavily wooded terrain along the Belgian-German border. Trees grew so densely that visibility dropped to 50 meters. Roads degenerated into muddy tracks. The forest floor was littered with fallen logs, ravines, and slopes that vehicles couldn't navigate. This was infantry country, close quarters, slow-moving, grinding, attritional warfare, where mechanized mobility meant nothing. German defenders knew it. They'd spent months fortifying the forest, bunkers disguised as woodpiles, artillery pre-registered on every trail junction, machine gun nests positioned to create crossfires down the only passable routes. They'd flooded valleys by damming streams, creating swamps that made off-road movement impossible. They'd booby-trapped the forest trails with mines and tripwires. And they'd prepared a special psychological welcome for the Americans. Oberst Friedrich Müller, commanding the German defenders in this sector, had studied intelligence reports about the 5th Armored Division. Fast-moving mechanized units, he concluded, were psychologically dependent on mobility and speed. Trap them in terrain where they couldn't maneuver, force them into slow infantry combat, and their morale would crack. The Americans are soft, he told his officers. They're comfortable with their vehicles and their industrial superiority. In the Hürtgenwald, their tanks are useless. Their half-tracks can't maneuver. They'll have to fight like regular infantry, and they don't have the stomach for it. We'll bleed them until they break. The 46th Battalion entered the Hürtgen Forest on November 2, 1944. Private Morrison had thought he understood cold. November in eastern France had been miserable. Freezing rain, mud, perpetual dampness that seeped through every layer of clothing. The Hurtgen forest was worse. The trees blocked most daylight, creating permanent twilight. Water dripped constantly from the canopy above, soaking everything. The temperature hovered just above freezing, too warm for snow, too cold for comfort. And the smell, decaying vegetation, cordite from constant artillery fire, and something else Morrison didn't want to identify. His half-track was parked 300 meters behind the front line, useless in this terrain. For the first time since joining the battalion, Morrison was fighting as straight infantry, slogging through mud with his rifle and whatever he could carry. The Germans were everywhere and nowhere. You'd advance 50 meters without seeing anything, then machine gun fire would erupt from a bunker you'd walked past. You'd clear one position, move forward, and the Germans would reoccupy it behind you. Artillery rounds burst in the treetops, creating deadly air bursts of shrapnel and wood splinters that shredded anyone caught in the open. And the trees, the constant trees, pressing in, limiting visibility, making every step forward feel like walking into an ambush. On the third day, Morrison's squad was tasked with clearing a German bunker that was holding up the advance. They knew it was there, somewhere, but couldn't see it through the forest undergrowth. They advanced in a skirmish line, weapons ready. The German machine gun opened fire at 20 meters range. 3 men went down instantly. Morrison hit the dirt behind a log, heart hammering. Return fire was useless. He couldn't see the bunker through the vegetation. Grenades couldn't reach it. They were pinned. This had never happened with the half-tracks. When a German position opened fire, the .50 caliber would suppress it, the squad would flank, and the fight would be over in minutes. Here they were stuck, unable to move forward or back without running through the German machine gun's beaten zone. They lay there for 4 hours until darkness allowed them to withdraw. That night, back at the company position, Morrison saw something he'd never seen before. Sergeant Harris looked old, exhausted. The Kentucky veteran who'd seemed indestructible through 3 months of mobile warfare sat on his helmet, shoulders slumped, staring at nothing. "Sarge?" Morrison ventured. Harris looked up slowly. "In 3 months of fighting, we lost 17 men in this company. 3 months of racing across France, breaking through the Siegfried Line, hitting German positions at full speed." He gestured toward the dark forest. "In 3 days here, we've lost 9. But we're still advancing." "Are we?" Harris's voice was flat. "We took 300 meters today. Cost us 9 casualties. At that rate, to advance 5 kilometers will take—" He did the math. "About 150 dead and wounded. 1 company." Morrison had no answer. The Germans had been right about one thing. The Hurtgen forest negated the 46th Battalion's mobility advantage. The half-tracks mostly sat immobile, serving as supply vehicles and casualty evacuation transports. The tanks could only operate on the few improved roads where German anti-tank guns waited in ambush. The infantry had to fight like conventional infantry, slogging through mud and forest, clearing positions one by one. It should have broken them, but something else happened instead: adaptation and endurance. Lieutenant Colonel McCulloch stood in his command post, a converted German bunker, studying situation maps. The Hurtgen offensive was going badly for everyone. The entire American First Army was grinding forward at horrific cost. Divisions were being chewed apart in the forest. Casualties were approaching 60% in some units. The 46th Battalion had taken heavy losses, 30% casualties in 3 weeks. But unlike some units, they hadn't broken, hadn't lost cohesion, hadn't devolved into disorganized groups of frightened men. McCulloch thought he understood why. The battalion's training, its integration with armor, its emphasis on coordinated action, all that made them an incredibly effective mobile force. But underneath that tactical training was something else: unit cohesion. The men had trained together for 2 years. They knew each other. Tank crews knew infantry squad leaders by name. Radio operators had learned each other's voices. Officers had gone through 100 combined exercises with their counterparts in the armor. When the mobility advantage disappeared in the Hurtgen forest, that cohesion remained. Morrison saw it every day. Even without the half-tracks, even fighting as dismounted infantry, his squad operated with practiced coordination. Sergeant Harris didn't have to explain tactics. The squad knew how to support each other, how to communicate with minimal radio traffic, how to trust that when Harris said, "Move," the covering fire would be there. The tank crews, unable to support directly in most of the forest, instead became artillery coordinators, using their better radios to call in fire missions. Lieutenant Cortez, Big Bertha's commander, spent hours each day on the radio with Morrison's company, directing artillery onto German positions that infantry had identified but couldn't engage directly. The half-track drivers, frustrated at their vehicles' uselessness in the forest, organized resupply and casualty evacuation rotations, ensuring frontline infantry had ammunition and hot food even in the worst conditions. The battalion adapted. Officers developed new tactics for forest fighting, smaller assault groups, more emphasis on grenade and close-range combat, coordination with artillery observers for tree-burst fire that turned German bunkers into death traps. They brought forward the battalion's anti-aircraft vehicles, M16 half-tracks with quad 50 caliber guns, and used them to shred German positions with concentrated fire at close range. Most importantly, they refused to accept the forest as fundamentally different from mobile warfare. The same principles still applied: combined arms, rapid reaction, mutual support. The implementation was different, the tempo was slower, but the underlying doctrine remained, and German defenders, expecting the soft Americans to break, instead encountered something they didn't anticipate: an opponent who could adapt without losing cohesion. Oberst Miller revised his assessment in early December. In a report to Corps headquarters, he wrote, "The American armored infantry fighting in this sector have proven unexpectedly resilient. Despite heavy casualties and terrain that negates their mechanized advantages, they maintain unit discipline and continue offensive operations. They are not, as intelligence suggested, dependent on their vehicles for combat effectiveness. The vehicles are tools, but the soldiers remain formidable even without them. Recommend..." The report ended there. Before Miller could file it, a new crisis erupted. Bulge. The ultimate test, December 16, 1944. So 5:30 hours. Private Morrison was awakened by artillery fire, not the occasional harassment fire that German guns lobbed at American positions each night, but a massive, sustained barrage that seemed to come from every direction at once. Within minutes, the entire 46th Battalion was on alert. Within an hour, they knew something catastrophic had happened. The Wehrmacht had launched a massive offensive through the Ardennes, the same forested terrain where German armor had broken through in 1940. 25 divisions, including elite SS Panzer units, had smashed into a lightly held American sector. The attack achieved complete surprise. American units were being overrun, cut off, destroyed. The German objective: break through to Antwerp, cut off Allied supply lines, and potentially split the Allied forces, forcing a negotiated peace. Hitler had staked everything on this offensive. It was Germany's last mobile reserve, last chance to avoid total defeat. And standing in the path of the German advance, rushed forward to plug gaps in the disintegrating American line, were mobile units from Patton's Third Army, including the 5th Armored Division, including the 46th Armored Infantry Battalion. December 22nd, near Bastogne. The half-tracks were running again, but not in the triumphant advance Morrison remembered from September. This was retreat, or rather, organized withdrawal to new defensive positions. The entire American line was collapsing. German panzers were punching through everywhere. The radio crackled with desperate calls, positions overrun, units cut off, requests for relief that couldn't be answered. Morrison's battalion was deployed as a mobile reserve, a fire brigade in military parlance. They raced from crisis to crisis, arriving at threatened sectors just in time to blunt German attacks, then rushing to the next emergency. The conditions were hellish. Winter had arrived with brutal force. Temperatures below zero, snow and ice covering the roads. Visibility reduced to nothing during frequent blizzards. The half-tracks, designed for mobility, now struggled on icy roads. Frostbite became as dangerous as German fire. But the crisis demanded speed, and speed was what the 46th could deliver. December 23rd, 0400 hours. Morrison's company received orders. German armor had broken through at a crossroads 10 kilometers north. 2 American infantry companies were surrounded. Get there before the Germans consolidated their position. The half-tracks moved through darkness on frozen roads, no lights, relying on the lead vehicle's night vision. Morrison huddled in his greatcoat, rifle clutched against his chest. Around him, the other men sat in silence. After 4 months of continuous combat, from France to Germany to Belgium, there wasn't much left to say. They'd been fighting since August. They'd broken through the Siegfried Line. They'd endured the Hürtgen Forest. Now German panzers were trying to push them back to the start line. Sergeant Harris's voice cut through the engine noise. 10 minutes out. Check weapons. We're going in hot. Morrison's hands moved automatically, checking his Garand's action, counting ammunition pouches. Muscle memory developed through hundreds of repetitions. The half-track slowed. Ahead, in the pre-dawn darkness, Morrison could hear fighting, the distinct crack of German Mausers, the answering pop of American Garands, and underneath it all, the deep rumble of tank engines. Lieutenant Cortez's voice on the radio, professionally calm despite the chaos. 3 German tanks at the crossroads, looks like Panzer IVs, infantry support in the buildings. We're engaging. Big Bertha's 75mm fired, illuminating the landscape with muzzle flash. Morrison saw the scene in snapshots, snow-covered buildings, burning vehicles, dark shapes that might be tanks or might be shadows. The half-track lurched forward, swung right. Harris was already moving. Dismount. Assault formation. Clear those buildings. Morrison hit the frozen ground running. Bullets cracked past. High. The German infantry firing blind in the darkness. He reached a stone wall, dropped behind it. 2 other squad members appeared beside him. More shapes moving through the darkness. His platoon deploying with practiced coordination despite the chaos. A German tank exploded. Big Bertha had scored a hit. The burning Panzer illuminated the crossroads in flickering orange light. Morrison saw German infantry silhouetted against the flames, saw them turning to face this new threat from an unexpected direction. The 46th had done it again, arrived faster than the Germans expected, hit them while they were still consolidating their position, disrupted their attack before it could fully develop. The fight lasted 40 minutes. When dawn broke, the crossroads was back in American hands. The surrounded infantry companies were relieved, and Morrison's battalion was already receiving new orders. German breakthrough 15 kilometers east, move immediately. SS Obersturmbannführer Karl-Heinz Weber commanded a Kampfgruppe in the 1st SS Panzer Division, an armored battle group spearheading the German offensive. His unit had smashed through American lines on December 16th, captured bridges, cut supply routes, and driven deep into the American rear. For 5 glorious days, it had felt like 1940 again. Blitzkrieg, American units collapsing in confusion, roads clogged with retreating vehicles, the sense that one more push would shatter the entire Allied position. Then the American mobile reserves arrived. Weber's first encounter with the 5th Armored Division came on December 21st. His Kampfgruppe was approaching a critical road junction when American tanks appeared, not defensive positions, but moving columns that deployed directly from march into combat. Half-tracks fanned out, infantry dismounted under fire, and within minutes Weber's lead elements were engaged in a meeting engagement they couldn't win. He'd expected disorganized American units retreating in panic. Instead, he'd encountered a coordinated combined arms force that reacted faster than his own troops. Weber withdrew, regrouped, tried a flanking attack. The Americans were already there, blocking the route. Tried another approach. Ran into more American armor and infantry, working together with the same mechanical efficiency he'd observed in his first engagement. It was like fighting a mirror image of German doctrine, except the Americans did it better. Their infantry never fell behind, their tanks never outran support, and their response time to threats was frighteningly fast. By December 24th, Weber's Kampfgruppe had been fought to a standstill, not destroyed. His unit still had combat power, but unable to advance further. Every route forward was blocked by American mobile forces that seemed to appear instantly wherever he tried to attack. In his command post, Weber studied maps and contemplated a bitter irony. The German offensive had been predicated on the belief that American forces, caught by surprise, would panic and collapse. The Ardennes terrain would prevent rapid American reinforcement. German armor would punch through to the Meuse River before the Allies could react. But the Americans had reacted. Units like the 46th Armored Infantry Battalion had rushed forward in brutal winter conditions, deploying directly from the march into combat, establishing defensive positions with a speed that made German breakthrough tactics obsolete. The Americans had turned the tables. They were using mobile warfare, Germany's own innovation, more effectively than the Wehrmacht itself. The turning point, December 26, 1944. The German offensive had reached its high water mark. The weather cleared, allowing Allied aircraft to attack German supply columns. American reinforcements continued to arrive. And critically, units like the 46th Battalion held key positions that prevented German armor from exploiting their initial breakthroughs. Private Morrison hadn't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 10 days. His face was wind-burned and frostbitten. His uniform was crusted with ice and mud. He'd lost count of the engagements his company had fought. But they were winning. He could feel it in the way German attacks came less frequently now, with less power behind them. Could see it in the prisoners, exhausted men from elite SS divisions who looked hollow-eyed and beaten. Could hear it in the radio traffic, which had shifted from desperate calls for help to coordinated counterattacks. The 46th Battalion, after 10 days of continuous combat in the worst winter conditions anyone could remember, was still operational, still mobile, still hitting back. Sergeant Harris gathered the squad that evening. 8 men. They'd started with 12, lost 2 wounded, gained 2 replacements. The survivors looked like ghosts. "Battalions being pulled out," Harris said. "We're going into reserve for refit and replacement. First Army says we've done enough." Someone laughed, a bitter sound. "Enough for what?" Harris looked at him steadily. "We stopped them. Third Army Mobile Reserves, including this battalion, plugged the holes, held the line, kept the Germans from reaching their objectives. It's over. They're not breaking through." Morrison felt something unclench in his chest. It was over. Not the war. That would continue for months yet. But this crisis, this desperate struggle in the frozen Ardennes, was over. The 46th had survived. More than that, they'd proven something. The Germans had launched their best offensive with their best troops, achieving complete surprise. And American mobile forces rushed forward in crisis conditions had stopped them cold. The nightmare the 46th represented to German commanders, fast-moving combined arms units that could react instantly to threats, had been validated in the worst possible combat conditions. Aftermath and reflection. January 1945. Rest area in France. Lieutenant Colonel McCullough addressed his battalion, or what remained of it. 4 months of continuous combat had reduced the unit to 60% strength. Every company had lost officers. Every platoon had casualties. But they were still cohesive, still functional, still a unit. "Gentlemen," McCullough said, "I've received our combat assessment from Third Army. Since landing in France last August, this battalion has been in continuous contact with enemy forces for 123 days. We've advanced over 500 kilometers. We've engaged in 217 separate combat actions. We've destroyed or captured 37 German armored vehicles, 114 artillery pieces, and over 2,000 enemy soldiers." He paused. "We've also paid the price. 73 men killed in action, 211 wounded, 16 missing." The numbers hung in the cold air. "But I want you to understand what you've accomplished. This battalion pioneered a new form of warfare, combined arms integration at the tactical level, infantry that moves with armor, fights with armor, never separates from armor. The Germans invented blitzkrieg, but we perfected it, and in doing so, we terrified them." He pulled out a captured German intelligence document. This is from Wehrmacht High Command, dated December 30th. Intelligence Assessment of American Armored Infantry Battalions. I'll read you the relevant passage. American armored infantry represent a fundamental tactical innovation that negates traditional defensive doctrine. Their speed of deployment, integration with armor, and rapid response capability create a psychological as well as tactical advantage. German forces report difficulty in effectively engaging these units due to their flexibility and momentum. McCulloch looked up. It doesn't matter what they recommend. The point is, you did this. You created a new way of fighting that the German army, with all its experience and tactical sophistication, couldn't counter. You became their nightmare. Back in his half-track, Private Morrison tried to process it all. 4 months ago, he'd been a replacement, terrified and uncertain. Now he was a veteran. He'd fought across France, breached the Siegfried Line, endured the Hürtgen Forest, stopped the German offensive in the Ardennes. The half-track that had seemed like just a vehicle in August was now home. He knew every bolt, every oil stain, every quirk of its engine. The men around him weren't just fellow soldiers, they were squad mates who'd saved his life, and whose lives he'd saved. And Lieutenant Cortez's voice on the radio, calm and professional, had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Sergeant Harris settled onto the bench beside him. The Kentucky veteran looked older than his 30 years, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there in the desperate days of the Bulge. "What are you thinking?" Harris asked. Morrison considered. "I'm thinking about that German officer we captured near Bastogne, the SS guy. He kept saying we weren't supposed to fight like this, that armored infantry wasn't real doctrine, that we were improvising. What did you tell him?" "I told him we trained for 2 years before we ever fired a shot in combat. Every tactic, every radio procedure, every combined assault, we'd practiced it hundreds of times. We weren't improvising. We were doing exactly what we were designed to do." Harris nodded slowly. "And that's what scared them. They thought American soldiers were just farm boys with good equipment. They didn't understand that we'd turned warfare into a system, that we'd solved the problems their blitzkrieg couldn't solve, keeping infantry with the armor, always, no matter what. Did we win the war? We won our part of it. We showed that mechanized warfare works both ways, not just for breakthrough and exploitation, but for rapid reaction and defense. The Germans invented it for attack. We perfected it for everything else." Morrison looked around at the battered half-track, at the tired men, at the damaged equipment that would need weeks to repair. "What happens next?" Harris smiled grimly. "Next? We go back in. Germany's not finished yet. But they know we're coming, and they know exactly what's coming for them." The final drive. March 1945, the 46th Armored Infantry Battalion crossed the Rhine River as part of the Allied final offensive into the heart of Germany. The Wehrmacht, shattered by months of attritional combat, could no longer mount coherent defense, but the battalion's reputation preceded them. Captured German officers, interrogated by intelligence teams, consistently identified the 5th Armored Division and specifically the 46th Battalion as among the most feared Allied units. One German regimental commander, when asked which American forces he least wanted to face, answered simply, "The ones with the half-tracks. The ones who arrive with their tanks. You cannot fight them with normal tactics." The psychological impact of the 46th's operations extended far beyond their actual combat engagements. German units across the front had heard about the American armored infantry, heard the stories of defensive positions overrun in minutes, of attacks that came faster than defenders could react, of the futility of trying to isolate American tanks or infantry because they never separated. In April 1945, the battalion entered Czechoslovakia as part of the Third Army's drive eastward. German resistance was collapsing everywhere. The war in Europe had weeks, not months, remaining. Private Morrison, now a corporal and squad leader, stood in his half-track watching the countryside roll past. Beside him, Big Bertha led the column. Lieutenant Cortez had been promoted to captain, but still commanded the same tank. Sergeant Harris, now a lieutenant, rode in the command half-track. The unit that had landed in France 9 months earlier as an untested innovation in military doctrine was now a veteran formation that had written the textbook on mechanized combined arms warfare. May 8, 1945. VE Day. The 46th Armored Infantry Battalion was in western Czechoslovakia when the announcement came. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Morrison sat on Big Bertha's hull, sharing a cigarette with Lieutenant Cortez. Around them, the battalion was celebrating, cautiously the way combat veterans celebrate, knowing that joy must be tempered by memory. "You know what I'll remember most?" Cortez said suddenly. "September 14th, crossing into Germany, being the first Allied ground unit to enter the Reich, that moment when we breached the Siegfried Line and German soldiers realized their fortress wasn't a fortress at all." Morrison nodded. "I'll remember the looks on their faces, the German prisoners. They kept asking how we moved so fast, how we were everywhere at once, how we'd done what we'd done. And we'd tell them, we trained together, we fought together, we never separated." "Simple concept," Cortez observed. "Infantry stays with the tanks. Tanks support the infantry. Combined arms at the tactical level." "Simple," Morrison agreed. "But no one else had done it, not really. The Germans came close, but their infantry always fell behind. We solved that problem." Cortez crushed out his cigarette. "You think they'll remember us? Future soldiers, future wars. Will they remember the 46th? Morrison considered. Around them, the half-tracks sat in neat rows, battered, worn, but functional. Beyond, the Sherman tanks of their attached armor units, the vehicles that had carried them from France to Germany to Czechoslovakia, the tools that had made them revolutionary. "Maybe not us specifically," he said, "but they'll remember what we proved, that mechanized infantry works, that combined arms isn't just a theory, it's a practical tactical system, that if you integrate infantry and armor completely, train them together, fight them together, never separate them, you create something that's more effective than either arm alone." "And psychologically," Cortez pressed. "The terror aspect? The Germans were more afraid of us than of most other units." Morrison thought about Hauptmann Reinhardt, the officer they'd captured near the Siegfried Line in September. The German had been professional, disciplined, but there'd been something in his eyes when he talked about fighting the 46th, a kind of helplessness. The recognition that traditional defensive tactics didn't work against an enemy who moved too fast, reacted too quickly, and refused to be separated into vulnerable components. "Fear is just respect mixed with uncertainty," Morrison said finally. "They feared us because they didn't understand us. By the time they figured out how we fought, we'd already won." Epilogue. The legacy. The 46th Armored Infantry Battalion was deactivated in November 1945. Its soldiers returned home, dispersed to civilian life, carrying memories of France and Germany and Belgium. But the doctrine they'd proven in combat became the foundation for mechanized warfare for the next half-century. The concept of armored infantry, infantry mounted in tracked vehicles that could keep pace with tanks, deploying rapidly to support armor operations, became standard across NATO armies. The M113 armored personnel carrier, the Bradley fighting vehicle, the Stryker, all descended from the tactical principles the 46th had pioneered with their M3 half-tracks. The integration of infantry and armor that had been revolutionary in 1944 became foundational to modern combined arms doctrine. No modern military would dream of operating tanks without accompanying mechanized infantry. The lesson had been learned and institutionalized. And in military academies and staff colleges, officers studying the campaigns of 1944-45 would inevitably encounter the 46th Armored Infantry Battalion, the unit that had perfected what Germany had attempted but never achieved, the unit that had become a nightmare for Wehrmacht commanders, the unit that had proven combined arms warfare could be more than theory. Years later, a military historian interviewed General Major Hans Kruger, the German officer who'd witnessed the 46th's operations in September 1944. The historian asked what had most surprised him about American forces. Kruger, now in his 70s, thought carefully before answering. "We expected Americans to fight with material superiority. More tanks, more artillery, more of everything. And they did. But what we didn't expect was tactical innovation. We'd invented mechanized warfare, blitzkrieg, combined arms. We thought we understood it better than anyone. And then we encountered units like the 46th Armored Infantry Battalion. What made them different? They'd solved our fundamental problem. In every German offensive, Poland, France, Russia, our tanks would break through, but our infantry couldn't keep up. We'd capture territory but couldn't hold it because the infantry arrived hours or days later. The Americans solved that. Their infantry rode in vehicles that could keep pace with tanks. More than that, they'd trained together, developed combined tactics, created radio procedures that allowed instant coordination. When we engaged their tanks, their infantry was already there. When we engaged their infantry, their tanks were already supporting. And psychologically? Kruger smiled grimly. Psychologically, it was devastating. Our soldiers were trained to fight tanks with anti-tank weapons and infantry with machine guns. But the Americans forced us to fight both simultaneously. It was disorienting, paralyzing. You couldn't isolate their armor. You couldn't pin their infantry. And they moved faster than we could react. Do you think it changed warfare? I think it perfected warfare, modern combined arms, true integration of infantry and armor at the tactical level. That's what the 46th Battalion represented. Germany invented the concept. America made it work. Private Morrison, Sergeant Morrison by war's end, then Corporal Morrison when he was demobilized in 1946, returned to Ohio. He married, raised a family, worked at a steel mill for 37 years. He rarely spoke about the war except with other veterans who understood. But once, late in life, a grandson asked him what he'd done in World War II. Morrison considered how to answer. How to explain to a child born decades after VE Day what it had meant to be part of the 46th Armored Infantry Battalion. How to convey the terror and exhaustion and pride. How to describe the feeling of rolling across France in a half-track, knowing you were part of something new, something revolutionary. I was in armored infantry, he said finally. We rode in vehicles with the tanks, half-tracks. We trained together for 2 years, infantry and tank crews, learning to work as one unit. Then we went to France and showed everyone how it was done. Were you scared? Every day. But we had each other, my squad, my tank crew, Lieutenant Cortez and Big Bertha, Sergeant Harris, all of them. We knew each other, trusted each other, and that made all the difference. Did you win? Morrison smiled. We won our part. We proved something that needed proving, that infantry and armor, working together completely, could beat anyone. The Germans were terrified of us because we fought in ways they couldn't counter. We moved too fast, hit too hard, never gave them time to react. Were you heroes? The old veteran considered. We were soldiers. We did what we were trained to do. But yes, we were part of something important. We changed how wars are fought. Every military in the world studied what we did. And what we proved in 1944 is still true today. Combined arms works. Infantry and armor, together, unstoppable. The grandson was quiet for a moment, then, I'm glad you came home. Me too, Morrison said softly. Me too. Reflection. The terror weapon that wasn't a weapon. The 46th Armored Infantry Battalion never fielded a superweapon, never deployed revolutionary technology, never possessed material advantages beyond what other American units had. They used the same half-tracks, the same rifles, the same Sherman tanks that equipped dozens of other units. What made them terrifying to German commanders wasn't equipment, it was doctrine. They'd solved the fundamental problem of mechanized warfare, how to keep infantry with armor during rapid mobile operations. The solution was elegantly simple: put infantry in tracked vehicles. But the implementation required years of training, new tactical procedures, radio protocols, and a fundamental reimagining of how infantry and armor cooperated. The Germans had pioneered blitzkrieg but never solved this problem completely. German mechanized infantry, Panzer Grenadiers, rode in half-tracks, yes, but they operated as separate units that coordinated with tanks rather than as integrated teams. In practice, German armor still routinely outran its infantry support. The 46th Battalion represented something different: complete tactical integration. Infantry squad leaders knew their tank commanders personally. Radio frequencies were shared. Battle drills were practiced until they became automatic. When a Sherman encountered resistance, infantry support wasn't minutes away. It was already there, already deploying, already attacking. This created a psychological effect beyond mere tactical advantage. German soldiers encountering this new form of warfare found their training and doctrine inadequate. You couldn't ambush American tanks because infantry immediately counterattacked. You couldn't pin American infantry because tanks immediately provided fire support. And critically, the American response came so quickly that German forces couldn't complete their own tactical actions before being disrupted. It was, in essence, the weaponization of tempo. The 46th moved inside German decision cycles, reacting faster than Wehrmacht units could respond. This created a cascade of effects: tactical confusion, defensive paralysis, and ultimately psychological demoralization. By the time German commanders figured out how to counter armored infantry tactics, the war was already lost. The 46th and units like it had breached the Siegfried Line, stopped the Ardennes offensive, and driven deep into Germany. The tactical innovation had strategic consequences, and the legacy endured. Modern mechanized warfare, from the Cold War to Desert Storm to contemporary conflicts, is built on the foundations the 46th Armored Infantry Battalion pioneered: the integration of infantry and armor, the emphasis on mobility and rapid response, the doctrine of combined arms at the tactical level. All trace their lineage to units like the 46th that proved these concepts in combat against a skilled, experienced enemy. The terror weapon that broke German resistance wasn't a bomb or a tank or a secret technology. It was an idea executed with precision by soldiers who'd trained together until they functioned as a single organism. It was the proof that doctrine, properly implemented, could be more powerful than any material advantage. And for Wehrmacht commanders in the autumn of 1944, watching American armored infantry roll across France and into Germany with unstoppable momentum, that realization was the most terrifying thing of all.